Hello, this is Dr. Christian Lehman, and this is a special edition of reading the Victorian novel. In this, I will be talking about the evolution of Miss Mowcher, Dickensian retcon in the face of litigation. So in this video, what I'm going to do is go through how Miss Mowcher is introduced in David Copperfield, the series of letters between Jane Seymour Hill, Dickens, and Hill's lawyer, and then the ways in which Miss Mowcher reappears after her first appearance in subsequent parts. So we start with Mowcher's introduction in chapter 22. I felt some curiosity and excitement about this lady, especially as Steerforth burst into a fit of laughing when I referred to her, and positively refused to answer any question of which I made her the subject. I remained, therefore, in a state of considerable expectation until the cloth had been removed some half an hour, and we were sitting over our decanter of wine before the fire, when the door opened, and Litimer, with his habitual serenity quite undisturbed, announced, "Miss Mowcher!" I looked in the doorway and saw nothing. I was still looking in the doorway, thinking that Miss Mowcher was a long while in making her appearance, when, to my infinite astonishment, there came waddling round a sofa, which stood between me and it, a pursy little dwarf of about 40 or 45, with a very large head and face, a pair of roguish gray eyes, and such extremely little arms that, to enable herself to lay a finger archly against her snub nose as she ogled Steerforth, she was obliged to meet the finger halfway and lay her nose against it. Her chin, which was what is called a double chin, was so fat that it entirely swallowed up the strings of her bonnet, bow and all. Throat she had none. Waist she had none. Legs she had none worth mentioning. For though she was more than full-sized down to where her waist would have been, if she had had any, and though she terminated as human beings generally do in a pair of feet, she was so short that she stood at a common-sized chair as at a table, resting a bag she carried on the seat. This lady, dressed in an offhand, easy style, bringing her nose and her forefinger together with the difficulty I have described, standing with her head necessarily on one side, and with one of her sharp eyes shut up, making an uncommonly knowing face, after ogling Steerforth for a few moments, broke into a torrent of words. The reason why I'm emphasizing this passage is because in the letter that follows, Jane Seymour Hill will say, the description of me is so specific and so accurate that everybody recognizes the physical description. Her complaint will especially come with the words that Dickens puts in her mouth. And that's where we pick up. And this has to do with the double speak of Miss Mowcher. So people will say that the original criticism is because Dickens had set Miss Mowcher up to be something of a panderer. That is the go-between who would facilitate sexual liaisons between rich men and lower class women, or just women in general. And Mowcher would go between, find these women for her clients. In order to follow this logic, though, you have to read the doublespeak of this exchange. And this is something that's not usually spelled out for the reader. So I hope to do that for you now. I never did in my days behold anything like Mowcher as she stood upon the dining table, intensely enjoying this refreshment, rubbing busily at Steerforth's head and winking at me over it. So immediately we have this like winking gesture, which is also out to the audience, and this invitation to maybe like look at things as though they are innuendo. "Ah," she said, "such things are not much in demand hereabouts. That sets me off again. I haven't seen a pretty woman since I've been here, Jemmy." So here, Mowcher brings up the subject of pretty women. She also calls Steerforth Jemmy, which is so not James. It's like slang for a pry bar. "No," said Steerforth. "Not the ghost of one," replied Miss Mowcher. "We could show her the substance of one, I think," said Steerforth, addressing his eyes to mine. "Eh, Daisy?" So now Steerforth is going to engage in this doublespeak as well. He's going to bring up that he is interested in a woman. So that's essentially what Mowcher has done. Mowcher's been like, hey, I haven't seen any girls here that you want me to kind of find. Steerforth says, well, there is one, but he includes David in this so as to kind of create a tricky double situation. Yes, indeed, said I. Aha, cried the little creature, glancing sharply at my face, then peeping round at Steerforth's. So here, Mowcher's trying to gauge what is the relationship between David and Steerforth. Is David also somebody that is a potential client? The first exclamation sounded like a question put to both of us. The second like a question put to Steerforth only. Boom. There's their strict textual evidence of there being a doublespeak happening, right? Two different audiences saying the same thing. She seemed to have found no answer to either, but continued to rub with her head on one side and her eye turned up as if she were looking for an answer in the air and were confident of its appearing presently. A sister of yours, Mr. Copperfield, she cried after a pause and still keeping the same same lookout. I. No, said Steerforth before I could reply. Nothing of the sort. On the contrary, Mr. Copperfield used, or I am much mistaken, to have a great admiration for her. Why hasn't he now? Returned Miss Mowcher. Is he fickle? Or, for shame, did he sip every flower, change every hour until Polly his passion requited? Is her name Polly? So here we start getting Mowcher leaning a little bit more on the innuendo. Here she's quoting McKeith. Using, right, it's a metaphor, right? Sipping every flower, changing every hour, this idea of men that flit from flower to flower. Women, right? That's the innuendo there. The elfin suddenness with which she pounced upon me with this question and a searching look quite disconcerted me for a moment. No, Miss Mowcher, I replied. Her name is Emily. Immediately at this point, Mowcher is very certain that David is naive and is not part of this rakish, Byronic behavior that Steerforth is. Aha, she cried exactly as before. What a rattle I am, Mr. Copperfield. Ain't I volatile? Her tone and look implied something that was not agreeable to me in connection with the subject. So I said, in a graver manner than any of us had yet assumed, she is as virtuous as she is pretty. She is engaged to be married to a most worthy and deserving man in her own station of life. I esteem her for her good sense as much as I admire her for her good looks. So part of the humor that's generated here is how clueless David is about the larger question at hand, which is going to be Mowcher trying to get Steerforth to tell her which girl to connect him with. And so David is overly earnest. Steerforth continues. Well said, cried Steerforth. Here, here, here. Now, I'll quench the curiosity of this little Fatima, my dear Daisy, by leaving her nothing to guess at. So Steerforth, right, calling Mowcher Fatima is orientalizing this whole exchange, which is going to be about kind of the movement of women for a man's pleasure, right? This is a series of stereotypes that he's activating here. And he's also saying to Mowcher, hey, I'm going to make this clear to you, but he's going to also do it through doublespeak. She is at present apprenticed Miss Mowcher or articled or whatever it may be to Omer and Joram, haberdashers, milliners, and so forth in this town. Do you observe? Omer and Joram. So Steerforth has just told Mowcher where she works. Now he's going to say why that's important. The promise of which my friend has spoken is made and entered into with her cousin, Christian name Ham, surname Peggotty, occupation boat builder, also of this town. She lives with a relative. So do not go to her house. She lives with family, so she's not going to be approachable there. Instead, know where she works. Christian name unknown, surname Peggotty, occupation seafaring, also of this town. Steerforth now is going to say his interest in her. She is the prettiest and most engaging little fairy in the world. I admire her, as my friend does, exceedingly. This is Steerforth saying, make it happen. I want you to go as the in-between for us. If it were not that I might appear to disparage her intended, which I know my friend would not like, I would add that to me, she seems to be throwing herself away, that I am sure she might do better, and that I swear she was born to be a lady. So laying it out all again, like, Miss Mowcher, go to Emily. She works at Omer and Jorum's. Tell her I'm interested. Here's the code. Tell her she deserves to be a lady. These are things that I am saying. Miss Mowcher listened to these words, which were very slowly and distinctly spoken, right? Dickens making it very clear that we should pay more attention to what Steerforth had just said. When her head was on one side and her eye in the air, as if she were still looking for that answer. When he ceased, she became brisk again in an instant and rattled away with surprising volubility. Oh, and that's all about it, is it? She exclaimed, trimming his whiskers with a little restless pair of scissors that went glancing around his head in all directions. Very well, very well. Quite a long story, ought to end, and they lived happily ever afterwards, oughtn't it? What's that game at forfeits? I love my love with an E because she's enticing. I hate with an E because she's engaged. I took her to the sign of the exquisite and treated her with an elopement. Her name's Emily, and she lives in the East. Ha ha ha, Mr. Copperfield, ain't I volatile? So here, Mowcher says, I confirm, her name's Emily. I'm going to arrange an elopement. Merely looking at me with extravagant slyness and not waiting for any reply, she continued without drawing breath. So Mowcher knows that they've succeeded in having this conversation that went over Copperfield's head. There, if ever any scrapgrace was trimmed and touched up to perfection, you are, Steerforth. If I understand any novel in the world, I understand yours. Do you hear me when I tell you that, my darling? I understand yours. Peeping down into his face. Now you may mizzle, Jemmy, as we say at court. And if Mr. Copperfield will take the chair, I'll operate on him. So here she has said, I understand what you want me to do. Go as the in-between, go to Emily at Omer and Jorum's, tell her you want to elope and that she deserves to be a lady, right? Lead her on. Jane Seymour Hill responds shortly after this installment appeared on the 18th of December, 1849. If you had attacked me in the full time of health, wealth, and happiness, I think perhaps I could have borne it with patience. But now, widowed in all but my good name, you show up my personal deformities with insinuations that by the purest of my sex may be construed to the worst of purposes. All know you have drawn my portrait, I admit it, all right? I admit that the physical description of me looks like me. But the vulgar slang of language, I deny, right? That doublespeak, that sexualized doublespeak is not accurate to me, and you have misrepresented me, Seymour Hill is telling Dickens. May your widow and children never meet with such blighting as you have poured on my miserably nervous head. Should your book be dramatized and I not protected, madness will be the result. I have suffered long and much from my personal deformities, but never before at the hands of a man so highly gifted as Charles Dickens, and hitherto considered as a Christian, a friend to his fellow creatures. Now you have made my nights sleepless and my daily work tearful. Tell me how I have deserved your anger. So here we have Mowcher laying out the consequences of this, right? This actually, she was presented twice on the stage in the stereotypical form. So we did have this, the damage to that public reputation. And we'll also see later on the popularity of Fizz's illustration that was also caricatured. This is followed up with Dickens's response that afternoon to Mrs. Jane Seymour Hill, 18 December, 1849, right? A lot of this happens immediately. Madam, I am most exceedingly and unfeignedly sorry to receive your letter. Here we have a little better edition of it. Of giving you a moment's distress. I am bound to admit that in the character to which I take it for granted you refer, I have yielded to several little recollections of your general manner, but I assure you that the original of a great portion of that character is well known to me and to several friends of mine, and is wholly removed from you and a very different person. All right, he's protesting too much. He's like, oh, yeah, a bunch of us know who I actually based this on. Indeed, I never represent an individual, but always a combination of individuals in one. To avoid giving offense, when I was conscious of remembering you, as where the person is represented as using a chair for a table and so forth, I was most careful, as I considered, to keep the calling, domestic circumstances, etc., of the character quite clear of yours. And I assure you that I had no idea of mixing you up with it further than by a whimsical, shadowy possibility of association that I thought might be even amusing and serviceable to you rather than the reverse. So now he's gaslighting her. He's like, why aren't you complimented by this thing that I did if you see yourself in it? So he's also like self-contradicting, right? He's at first he says, oh, it's not supposed to be you. And he's like, oh, here's this very specific thing that is you, but I thought it would be good. As to personal appearances, I have been for years in the habit of meeting in the streets someone unknown to me by name or pursuit, whom it resembles almost as not quite as much as it resembles you. If I had the least thought of presenting you personally in my book, I could have had your portrait drawn any morning in the week and put there. Pray consider all these things and do not make yourself unhappy. So now he's saying, you know, if I really wanted it to be you, I could have done so with extreme specificity. He then says, I should be most truly pained if you were to remain under the impression that you have any cause of complaint against me, or that I have done you any injury, however innocently. I am so sincere in this belief, believe me, that rather than you should pass another of those sleepless nights of which you write to me, or go another morning tearfully to your daily work, I would alter the whole design of the character and remove it, in its progress, from the possibility of that bad construction at which you hint. I am quite serious in this. I do not mean it to be a very good character now, but I will make it so and oblige the reader to hold it in a pleasant remembrance, if that will give you any relief from this, by me, quite unexpected and unforeseen distress. So here's the offer. Dickens says, all right. And it's like, in making this offer, it is a confession that he has done wrong. He's like, I can change the character. I wanted it to be this like really villainous character operating on a number of disability stereotypes of little people, but I can transform her. That afternoon, he complains to his best friend Forster. I have had the queerest adventure this morning. The receipt of the enclosed from Miss Mowcher. It is serio-comic, but there is no doubt one is wrong in being tempted to such a use of power. Here, right, he just admits, like, Jane Seymour Hill is Miss Mowcher. Like, that's what he calls her in his personal correspondence. He also is saying, like, oh, I'm kind of like torn about how I'm receiving this letter, but maybe I am abusing her, right? There's no doubt one is wrong in being tempted to use such a power. That's Dickens talking about himself being wrong to write her this way. 2 days later, Robert Rogers, Hill's lawyer, writes to Dickens. And this is from the notes in the Pilgrim Letters. Rogers had written to Charles Dickens on Mrs. Hill's behalf on the 20th of December. It was, he said, quote, but too conclusively clear that the character of Miss Mowcher applied in popular opinion to his client. Apart from the, quote, great mental torture and injury, end quote, Charles Dickens's publication had caused her, there were, quote, certain passages which convey insinuations gravely affecting moral character and consequently highly injurious to Mrs. Hill in the exercise of her profession, end quote. Dickens's victim was a widow, quote, suffering under one of the heaviest domestic afflictions a woman can know, end quote. She had been advised, quote, by several of her friends to adopt a course to which I will not more particularly allude, end quote, but had impulsively decided to appeal to Charles Dickens first. This not more particularly allude is litigation. Miss Hill is saying, she's going to sue Dickens. But then she sent this letter to him. The tenor of Dickens's answer, though in some respects not quite so satisfactory as could be wished, led Rogers to believe that, in doing so, she had acted rightly. Mrs. Hill was, for the present, content to rely on Dickens's pledge, for such I deem it to be, to remedy the evil occasioned. Promptitude in this was, quote, obviously of essential importance. The poison is fast spreading. The antidote should follow without delay. I hope to receive an assurance that the promised work of reparation, if not completed, shall at least be effectively commenced in the next number of your publication, end quote. So Rogers's letter said, change it immediately. Dickens replies with reference to the nature of serial publication. Sir, I received your letter late last night. Now that I learn from you that Mrs. Hill and her friends consider the alteration I offered in my letter to her to make the character in question will tend to repair the uneasiness I have unintentionally caused her. I have not the least hesitation in pledging myself to make it. But I must beg you to understand that it can only be made in the natural progress and current of the story. Even if the next number were not already in the press, it would be impossible to be made there because the character is not introduced. And the course of the tale is not at all in that direction. Dickens, right? So here he's saying, I am making this change, but I also need to attend to my craft, the plotting of my novel. This was on the 21st of December. So a lot of this, right, is happening very quickly. On Christmas, he writes to Burdett Coutts, this rather long letter, the end of which says, when I see you, I will give you the latest Mowcher intelligence. It has been of a threatening character, but I hope it has become pacific, meaning peaceful, right? So he's like, and notice again, he calls Seymour Hill Mowcher. And it's clear this has been on his mind, and he's upset, petulant, frustrated by it happening. On February 12th, he whines again to Coutts, quote, I am at present repairing Miss Mowcher's injury with a very bad grace and in a very ill humor, right? So he doesn't like that he has to do this. He ends up, though, doing something amazing, which is he turns her into the mouthpiece for like disability activism, in a lot of ways that seems directed at Dickens himself. And this is where we get the retconning of Miss Mowcher in March of 1850. So 3 months after, right? So really a pretty fast turnaround. Retcon is retroactive continuity. I might not have been prepared to give the little creature a very kind reception if, on her removing the umbrella, which her utmost efforts were unable to shut up, she had shown me the volatile expression of face which had made so great an impression on me at our first and last meeting. But her face, as she turned it up to mine, was so earnest, and when I relieved her in the umbrella, which would have been an inconvenience one for the Irish giant, she wrung her little hands in such an afflicted manner that I rather inclined towards her. So rather than the winking, innuendoing Ms. Mowcher that we first knew, now we have a figure that is earnest. She then continues to articulate her own situation. What can I do? Returned the little woman, standing up and holding out her arms to show herself. See what I am, my father was, and my sister is, and my brother is. I have worked for sister and brother these many years. Hard, Mr. Copperfield, all day. I must live. I do no harm. If there are people so unreflecting or so cruel as to make a jest of me, what is left for me to do but to make a jest of myself, them, and everything? If I do so for the time, whose fault is that? Mine. So the retconning is, she said, I was putting on an act, right? Other people make fun of me, and so I make the joke first. No, not Miss Mowcher's, I perceived. If I had shown myself a sensitive dwarf to your false friend, pursued the little woman, shaking her head at me with reproachful earnestness, how much of his help or goodwill do you think I should ever have had? If little Mowcher, who had no hand, young gentleman, in the making of herself, addressed herself to him, or the like of him, because of her misfortunes, when do you suppose her small voice would have been heard? Little Mowcher would have as much need to live if she was the bitterest and dullest of pygmies, but she couldn't do it. No, she might whistle for her bread and butter till she died of air. So Miss Mowcher saying, if I didn't put on this act, I couldn't even make any money. She then continues and like switches the blame and kind of places it on Copperfield. May the father of evil confound him, Steerforth, said the little woman, holding up her forefinger between me and her sparkling eyes, and 10 times more confound that wicked servant, Litimer. But I believed it was you who had a boyish passion for her. So she's like, I totally misread the situation. You were the first to mention her name. You owned an old admiration of her. You were hot and cold and red and white all at once when I spoke of you to her. What could I think? What did I think? And that you were a young libertine in everything but experience and had fallen into hands that had experience enough and could manage you, having the fancy for your own good. Oh, ho, ho. They were afraid of my finding out the truth, exclaimed Miss Mowcher, getting off the fender and trotting up and down the kitchen with her two short arms distressfully lifted up. Because I am a sharp little thing, I need be, to get through the world at all. And they deceived me altogether. And I gave the poor unfortunate girl a letter, which I fully believe was the beginning of her ever speaking to Litimer, who was left behind on purpose. So Ms. Mowcher says, I misread the situation. I thought you were the person interested in her, so I just innocently did these things. I knew Steerforth was a libertine and had experience, and I thought you were on that bad track. The public noticed this retconning, So Angus Reach in the Illustrated London News, which is cited in the letters, said, "Is it worthwhile recording under the head of Town Talk a very commonly made remark touching the last number of Mr. Dickens's serial, to wit, that the author has entirely altered his views of the role which little Miss Mowcher is to play in the fortunes of David Copperfield? The curious in the construction of novels ought to compare recent numbers." And then in April, so again, a month after Miss Mowcher first appeared, we get this political cartoon showing us this pastiche of a politician being dressed up by this figure who has the body of Mowcher. And then we get our final appearance of Miss Mowcher in the last part of Copperfield, chapter 61, where we learn that she's the one that apprehended Litimer, right? Kind of coming full circle. 28, returned my informant, speaking throughout in a low tone and looking over his shoulder as we walked along the passage to guard himself from being overheard in such an unlawful reference to these immaculates by Creakle and the rest. 28, also transportation, got a place and robbed a young master of a matter of 250 pounds in money and valuables the night before they were going abroad. I particularly recollect his case from his being took by a dwarf. A what? A little woman. I forgot her name. Not Mowcher. That's it. Had he eluded pursuit and was going to America in a flaxen wig and whiskers and such a complete disguise as never you see in all your born days, when the little woman, being in Southampton, met him walking along the street, picked him out with her sharp eyes in a moment, ran betwixt his legs to upset him, and held on to him like grim death. Excellent Miss Mowcher, cried I. You'd have said so if you had seen her standing on a chair in the witness box at the trial as I did, said my friend. He cut her face right open and pounded her in the most brutal manner when she took him. But she never loosed her hold till he was locked up. She held so tight to him, in fact, that the officers were obliged to take them both together. She gave her evidence in the gamest way and was highly complimented by the bench and cheered right home to her lodgings. She said in court that she'd have took him single-handed on account of what she knew concerning him if he had been Samson, and it's my belief she would. It was mine too, and I highly respected Miss Mowcher for it. So at the very end, Miss Mowcher is the one to actually apprehend Litimer. And she does so in this incredibly heroic manner. But also you'll remember Dickens had said in that first letter, oh, I see lots of little people, like it's clearly not supposed to be you. And then like the only person whose name David can come up with is like Mowcher as soon as he hears about somebody. So again, Dickens kind of telling on himself quite a bit. So that's just some thoughts on the evidence for the retconning of Miss Mowcher. Like Angus Reach, it is rather interesting for thinking about Dickens's craft and response to the public in the manner of serial publication.